Hello, welcome to Concordia Live. For those who are new here, my name is Ashley Abear, and I'm Concordia's Programming Manager. Thank you so much for joining us here today. A special thank you to our global patron member, the Kyle House Group, for organizing this discussion. The Kyle House Group has long worked with corporate, nonprofit, and governmental partners to support responsible sourcing and sustainability efforts throughout the world. As tomorrow is World Day Against Trafficking in Persons, today's conversation will focus on the ethical recruitment and forced labor of migrants. 1 in 4 victims of forced labor globally is a migrant. That's nearly 6 million people. Throughout their experience, through the recruitment process, at their destination, and upon their return, the migrant is always in a place of disadvantage or vulnerability. For the advancement of ethical recruitment to be effective and sustainable, cross-sector partnerships must form to collaborate on a holistic approach to promote a labor market in which ethical recruitment is the global standard. Our expert panelists today will provide these cross-sector stakeholders a chance to better understand these initiatives and how the promotion of ethical recruiting will be integrated into this work. The Kyle House Group looks forward to continuing to work with the organizations in this discussion and others to help advance responsible recruitment and other policies that support the dignity of workers throughout the global supply chain. A few quick housekeeping tips before we get started. All attendees are automatically muted upon entry, but we do hope that you'll take advantage of the chat feature to introduce yourself, react to comments in the discussion, and engage throughout the conversation. To ask a question, please utilize the same chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Our moderator will do her best to answer all questions at the end of the session. Lastly, this webinar will be recorded and available on Concordia's webpage and YouTube channel. I'm honored to introduce today's moderator, Anbinh Phan, as Walmart's Director of Global Government Affairs. Anbinh is responsible for government relations to advance Walmart's sourcing goals, focusing on responsible and global sourcing, supply chains and trade, and development. Anbinh, over to you.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you for hosting this session and for setting up this scene for our conversation today. I'm really excited to introduce our panelists and to dive into our discussion. Before I begin, I'd love to briefly share about Walmart's commitment to responsible recruitment. We aim to make responsible recruitment the industry norm by 2026 and do this through a variety of mechanisms, including operating in our own supply chains and engaging our suppliers through our supplier codes of conduct, and encouraging responsible recruitment activities among our suppliers. Also through our philanthropic efforts in the areas of market signals, worker voice, data and analytics, and rule of law. And we've invested over $40 million to organizations, many of which are here today and others to advance responsible recruitment, and also through government engagement, because we know that this is not a single country issue. It's not a private sector issue, it's a global issue. And so we need collaboration across stakeholders. So we are involved engaging governments directly and through processes such as the Bali Process Government and Business Forum to advance this initiative. And as we think of responsible recruitment, it's always so important to think of who are we talking about? And it is that migrant worker. Sometimes it's figures like 6 million migrants or 40 million people in human trafficking situations, but it's actually that garment worker, the Vietnamese garment worker in Jordan, who I met on an interview, or it's the Burmese workers who are in Thailand, who are on the docks and catching fish for the global seafood supply chain. So it's always about the migrants. And as the world is increasingly facing climate issues, and there's a rise in climate issues, such as reported in the Trafficking in Persons report, there will be more vulnerable populations, women and children. And so with that, I will turn to Neill from the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment. I've had the privilege to work with Neill, who is the head of the Migrant Workers Program for the Institute for Human Rights and Business. and Neill will begin to share with us a bit more about the issue and also the Daca principles, as well as what's lost in terms of economic development benefits through remittances. So Neill, can I turn it to you?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Anbinh. And hi, everyone. So I'm head of the Migrant Workers Programme at the Institute for Human Rights and Business. It's a particularly significant programme within the Institute. And another interesting fact and figure about migrant workers, there are 169 million in the world. That means that 1 in 20 of the global workforce is a migrant worker, 5%. And of course, these workers are nearly always the most vulnerable. Very often they're doing the jobs that nobody else wants to do for the lowest wages. And at all stages of the migration cycle, it's likely that they will be vulnerable to a range of exploitations, including in extremis, forced labour and trafficking. But I think that actually that might be a good place to start, because perhaps the biggest barrier to preventing forced labour and trafficking is a particular view of what slavery looks like. And maybe we do need to have a much better understanding of what modern slavery is. And that perhaps means that we move beyond ideas at the extreme end of the spectrum and actually consider that modern slavery, forced labour, is nearly always deeply entwined with lack of labour rights, and that perhaps we need to consider modern slavery as a continuum, a range of exploitations, usually relating to employment and recruitment conditions, but ranging from what would be decent work at one end of the spectrum to extreme examples of forced labour at the other. But the majority of situations that migrant workers in particular would find themselves in aren't at the extreme end, but will be the reality, a constant grind of small scale abuses that can then lead to more serious violations. A good framework for understanding this in relation to migrant workers are the IHRB Daca Principles for Migration with Dignity. And I'm sure that many of the people on the call are familiar with those. And I'm sure that Concordia can put that into the chat for everyone to have a look at, the link to the Daca Principles. But the Daca Principles provide this overarching framework for understanding the particular challenges that migrant workers face at every stage of the migration cycle. And they demonstrate how workers can be exposed to risk at every stage. And also, of course, that also means that companies who recruit and employ them, what risks do they face reputationally and operationally as well? And when we consider appropriate legislation to protect migrant workers, we should never forget that that also helps to protect law-abiding businesses who are trying to do the right thing, to stop those businesses being undercut by businesses that wouldn't be operating to such high standards. The Daca Principles also show us that the cycle of recruitment, of course, begins with recruitment, and a lot of the discussion here today will be about recruitment and what that means. And in particular, within that, IHRB and many others believe that it's the vulnerability that gets loaded onto migrant workers during recruitment, and in particular through the payment of recruitment charges, costs and fees, that loads vulnerability onto workers right from the start. They end up in situations of debt, which then makes them vulnerable to further exploitation. And we see this constantly. It is such embedded and entrenched practice in many supply chains globally. And please don't think that this only happens in the global south. It happens in Europe, it happens in the Americas as well. So I think that others are going to begin to talk about what we might do to prevent that. Anbinh mentioned the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment, which is a business initiative using the collective leverage of well-known brands to try to drive improved practice around this. I just want to finish by talking about an additional sort of element of this, and another reason why perhaps we should be paying attention to the way that workers are recruited, and that is the impact of migrant workers on the global economy. Migrant workers impact dramatically on the countries where they work, the countries of destination, but also on their countries of origin through the return of remittances back to those countries. And the sums are substantial. In the last year, even with COVID, migrant workers remitted approximately 589 billion US dollars to developing economies. Therefore, you have to conclude that if workers are busy servicing recruitment debt, then less of that remittance money will be used for development outcomes. So as well as preventing abuse and exploitation, there are other very sound economic reasons that we might like to consider a global prohibition on recruitment fees to workers. I'll stop there, Anbinh.
Thank you so much, Neill. Really appreciate the depth of your knowledge on the issue. And then also just clarifying for us what a global economic issue this is. It's not one issue in a corner. It's affecting the whole global economy, and how we have prosperity for the most vulnerable, but also for all. So thank you so much, Neill. I'm going to turn it over to Nic Ballou, who is a program manager at the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. And Nic, you have some really neat projects and investments that the fund is making. Love to hear more about them, how you're seeing the issue, and solutions that you're putting in place through your investments. So I'll turn it over to you, Nic.
Sure. Thanks, Anbinh, and thanks, Neill, for painting the picture of what the Daca Principles lay out and kind of setting the stage. So hi, folks. My name is Nic Ballou, as Anbinh mentioned, and I work at the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, which invests in a variety of different issues relating to modern slavery and human trafficking. And I oversee our ethical recruitment work primarily in South Asia. So I'm going to speak a bit more about the context in India specifically, and talk a little bit about the investment that we have there. So we invest in ethical recruitment projects ranging from direct service delivery to returning migrants, to services to prepare migrants before they've traveled abroad, to integration work for their families, as well as setting up ethical recruitment agencies. I think what I would like to do before talking a bit about our project interventions is paint the picture of what a migrant journey might look like. So in India, UP, Uttar Pradesh, and Bihar are the two largest sending states for migrant workers who are looking to work abroad in the Middle East. So I think to create a migrant profile, I'd like to talk a little bit about what the journey would look like. So migrant workers, usually who are leaving from these areas of India, are predominantly men who are anywhere in their ages of early 20s to late 40s to early 50s. And they are looking to travel abroad to make money and send remittances home, as Neill said. He spoke a little bit about recruitment fees, and the reality is that many of the migrant workers who are looking to travel abroad are working with a local sub-agent who may charge them anywhere from $1,000, $2,000 to $3,000 US to be traveling abroad. And these fees are covering things like airport tickets, like documents, so their work visas, their contracts, et cetera, and they're promising them a job abroad. What may happen in these small scale abuses around the recruitment process that Neill was talking about is that a migrant worker may be promised a tourist visa as opposed to a work visa to travel abroad, which means that when they arrive in their destination country, they are not legally allowed to work there, and they're not protected. What may also happen is they may be promised a false job contract. So they may be traveling abroad thinking that they're going to be working as a chauffeur, but instead they're placed in a construction or a welding position. So these are some of those small scale abuses that Neill was talking about. Once the migrant worker has paid these recruitment fees and has arrived at the destination country, sometimes their living quarters are not what they expected. They may be living with 5 or 6 other migrant workers. Sometimes their working hours are not what they expected. They may be working 6 or 7 days a week as opposed to the 5 that were promised in the job contract. And then very often they're not receiving payment on time or at the wage that they were promised. So, kind of circling back and returning to these issues of remittances and the social economic need for us to focus on unethical recruitment, workers are paying large amounts of debt and then are oftentimes not being paid the amount that they are promised, which means they're unable to repay the debt that they were promised, and of course are not sending those remittances home. So a lot of times these contracts are for about 1 to 2 years. One of the things that GFEM sees is that migrant workers really want to see longer term job contracts. They would like to have contracts that are for 5 or 10 years. And that really what that does is it allows them to repay these debts and to send money and to save money home. So I'll maybe take a pause there and briefly explain some of the work that GFEMS is doing to improve both the recruitment ecosystem and advance ethical recruitment in the space. Like I mentioned, we have both ethical recruitment agencies that we support, as well as source side or community side intervention efforts. And what that looks like is a migrant worker who may be at a destination country could potentially have contacted their family member back home who heard about a migrant resource center that a GFEMS project set up, which would then connect the family to a whole suite of resources, including access to a protector of immigrants office that may be able to facilitate a return of the migrant worker. We also have services that provide loans to family members so that they are able to start small entrepreneurship opportunities. We provide psychosocial reintegration support to returnees after they faced exploitation abroad. We provide various different microfinance support, so savings credits, bringing people into the formal financial institution. And then we do mass awareness raising to help migrant workers understand the risks of traveling with, a fake employment contract, potentially with a tourist visa, et cetera. So we're really trying to, create a more ethical recruitment ecosystem from both the grassroots level all the way through return. So that's, I think, kind of a brief update about what GFEMS is doing. Like I mentioned, we have a whole suite of different projects that we're working on, but that's kind of the main piece of direct migrant worker services that we provide in India.
Thank you, Nic. Your intervention really reminded us that there's real people behind these issues and the challenges that they face. And we take it for granted that we have information about employment, or we can do research, or that we have this knowledge, but it's not available to all, and it can be an opaque process. Also very encouraging to hear about the hope aspect, like there's microfinance available, there is information available, it's turning the tide and making that shift. So it's very hopeful, and that is a good sort of place to see your investments land. So thank you so much for sharing a bit about that. I'd love to next turn it over to Amy O'Neill Richard. We're so fortunate to have her. She's the Senior Advisor to the Director of the U.S. State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. And Amy is the longest standing member of the TIP office and a wealth of knowledge on a whole range of issues related to trafficking in persons. We're really fortunate to have her here today, and especially on the heels of the launch of the Trafficking in Persons report just a little bit over a week ago. So Amy, I'm really excited to hear how the USG is approaching these particular issues, research and information you found, and just to really get your insights overall, given your expertise and knowledge. So I'll turn it over to Amy. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Anbinh. Thank you, Concordia, for hosting this important panel. It's a pleasure to join fellow colleagues from Walmart and IOM and IHRB and GFEMS. And thank you also to all of you listening in today. Yes, I'm pleased to be able to share some of the State Department and US government's work and priorities in advancing responsible recruitment and some of our key findings. So the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons has long focused on preventing and addressing forced labor in global supply chains, Of course, advancing responsible recruitment has been and continues to be an integral component of such efforts. We're the State Department. We engage foreign governments bilaterally and multilaterally on forced labor, including using our annual Trafficking in Persons report. We also fund targeted research and programming to promote responsible recruitment. We've supported the NGO Verite in their efforts to develop due diligence tools, particularly on screening and evaluating suppliers and labor recruiters. Such tools can be found at responsiblesourcingtool.org. We also engage the private sector and facilitate conversations similar to this one among industry, NGOs, and other experts. Domestically, our Federal Acquisition Regulation, or FAR, prohibits US government contractors and subcontractors from charging recruitment fees. And so we're working with other US government agencies to encourage such implementation of our FAR. US government agencies are also taking steps to better prevent human trafficking within legal migration programs to increase the protections of victims and to promote responsible labor recruitment. The US National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking, which was updated and released in December of 2021, includes action items for federal agencies to mitigate aspects of certain non-immigrant visa programs that are known to increase the vulnerabilities that traffickers exploit, especially in the recruitment phase and employment phase. So in response to the National Action Plan, US government agencies have established a working group to analyze the rights and protections granted to temporary employment-based visa holders and to discuss ways to address any gaps and inconsistencies, including developing and proposing necessary regulatory or legislative changes. Other recent efforts to protect workers throughout the recruitment and employment process include the issuance of the Guidance on Fair Recruitment Practices for Temporary Migrant Workers by the Departments of State, Labor, and USAID last month. So this guidance is part of a multi-agency effort to promote best practices by those countries seeking to increase participation in the H-2A program for temporary agricultural workers and the H-2B program for seasonal non-agricultural workers, along with recruiters and employers who rely on these programs. The United States and Mexico have also launched a bilateral working group on labor migration pathways and worker protections. So we will work to promote greater worker protections as part of a labor mobility strategy for migrant workers who seek access to legal pathways. We're also going to continue to work together to improve economic and social conditions throughout the region, create dignified job opportunities as viable alternatives for potential migrants, and to tackle the root causes of irregular migration across the Americas. Okay, so despite the progress made so far, our findings show that more work is still needed, now more than ever. In this year's annual Trafficking in Persons report, we saw that the issue of labor recruitment came up repeatedly, whether in human trafficking profile concerns or in the recommendations that we laid out for governments. 3 of the main prioritized recommendations that we made across numerous countries' narratives included the following: strive to eliminate recruitment fees charged to workers, implement oversight and regulation of labor recruitment agencies, and 3, hold fraudulent labor recruiters accountable. In the United States country narrative, a key prioritized recommendation was for the US government to mitigate vulnerabilities in employment-based or other non-immigrant US visa programs, including by holding accountable non-compliant employers and labor contractors, as well as their agents, and to improve workers' access to timely and comprehensive job information. Finally, some quick findings from our funded research. We have research with the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. We heard earlier from Nic, and I just want to share a few notable findings. In Kenya, researchers estimated that 96.88% of Kenyan migrant workers in the Gulf countries had experienced deceptive recruitment. A study that covered Ugandan migrant workers in the Gulf countries found that ethical, fair recruitment leads to lesser incidents of forced labor. So overall, it was clear the data revealed that the prevalence of human trafficking and severe exploitation were lower among migrants who experienced fewer instances of unethical recruitment. The regression analysis indicated that with each additional unethical recruitment practice experienced, the odds of both human trafficking and severe exploitation nearly tripled. Finally, another project in Delhi, India, found that training micro contractors on ethical treatment of workers resulted in higher wages and lower rates of forced labor. Thanks. I know that was a lot of information, and anybody's welcome to reach out to me with further questions. Over.
Thank you so much, Amy. We can't take it for granted what the USG has done through the Trafficking in Persons report, the investments that you've made, and just even when you're talking about legal pathways, that's what the government can do. That's an action that the government can take. And it's also so important. You mentioned focused work on looking at root causes. That is very valuable work as well, because those viable alternative jobs are critical to the whole ecosystem as we look at this as a holistic and global issue. And so you started to launch us into sort of the research that you've done, and helpful to know that the direction of travel of ethical recruitment does end up working in favor of the migrant worker. So with that, thank you so much, Amy. I'm going to turn it over to Philip Hunter, who is the head of the Labor Migration Unit at the IOM. Philip, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you've done a lot of good work in setting up the IOM's policy network on ethical recruitment, and you have a wealth of experience working on a variety of initiatives. Please tell us a little bit more about IOM's work with IRIS, what the multi-stakeholder approach looks like, and what a whole systems approach looks like going forward. So I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much, Philip.
Great. Thanks, Anbinh, and thanks to Concordia and the Kyle House Group for bringing us together. It's a real pleasure for me to be here and to have the opportunity to speak with you all today. And thanks to the audience for your interest. For those of you joining on the East Coast or even further on, it's earlier for you. It's a little later for me in the day. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Yes, I think we've covered really well the nature of the issue we're here to discuss, and I'm thinking that perhaps I'll keep my remarks to a more forward-looking, future-looking orientation to keep us to push us into the home stretch, so to speak. Anbinh, you've mentioned some of IOM's work, something called the IRIS Global Policy Network. The IRIS initiative as a whole is our flagship vehicle for promoting ethical recruitment and rights and protections for migrant workers. Within that IRIS initiative, one very key, although recent pillar, focuses very much on government engagement. And we've just heard from Amy some fantastic examples of the way the US government is coming together, not only within the State Department, but across different, let's say, policy areas to adopt and promote a coordinated approach for government. And that was really the first point that I wanted to make. So I'm so pleased that Amy was already able to illustrate that in action. It's absolutely essential, I think, as we look towards the future, that we think holistically and system-wide as we engage on the topic of ethical recruitment. The abuses that migrants are facing are multifaceted, complex, and existing at multiple levels, which means that if we don't have all stakeholders on board, if we don't have all stakeholders participating, in strategic orientation and solution building, then we're never going to properly solve this problem. That means, of course, the business community, which has very much been at the forefront, and I'm so pleased that Neill is with us here today to have already reflected a little bit on the work of the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment. Anbinh, you mentioned also the Bali process business mechanism. These are great examples of the way the business community has rallied and come together in the supply chains context. So important is also, of course, the voice of civil society and all of its diversity to come to the table to enhance the role that they can play and to coordinate between themselves. I spent some time, Amy mentioned the NGO Verite, that's where I worked before. And what I found working within the civil society context is that not all civil society actors are built the same and focused on the same issues. So coming together, even within that category of stakeholders, is just so vital, so that diaspora groups are speaking with the business and human rights community, and they're speaking with the faith-based community and speaking with the labor rights and trade union movement, so that there's a coordinated approach. In the context of government, which is the most important aspect for me in my work within IOM, the launch of the Global Policy Network was driven very much by a sense of the same diversity within the category of government. So to recognize the role not only of federal authorities, but also, let's say, provincial authorities, I'm a Canadian, or state-based subnational authorities, in some cases also municipal authorities. When we talk about migrant worker protection, where do migrants go to receive that sort of protection? Sometimes they're municipal authorities, sometimes they're NGOs that are supported by municipal authorities. I think it's really important that we understand the full scope of government engagement across those different levels. Also the different policy areas that Amy mentioned: labor, foreign affairs, immigration, justice, counter-trafficking, even development cooperation actors within government have an important role. So that's the first point, is really just to adopt that multi-stakeholder, whole of society approach to tackling this, and it has to be a guiding principle for us going forward. The second point I wanted to emphasize, and just to very briefly carve out the history of this space, particularly in the supply chains context. For those of you who have been working on this topic for quite some time, you'll know that in the business and human rights space, we stretch back to the early 1990s with conversations around things like corporate social responsibility, codes of conduct, social audits, which then merged to become conversations around independent monitoring or verification. Interestingly, I think we've gotten to a place now, and more recently, to talk about things like due diligence, grievance mechanisms, access to remedy and justice. These are all very, very important recent developments. And what I want to flag for the colleagues here today is, Anbinh, actually something that you mentioned in your opening remarks, and that is, I think, something where we're just at the precipice of the next stage of our development in this space and in this collective conversation, and that's the issue of worker voice and empowerment. And for us, of course, as IOM, very, very important is migrant voice and empowerment in that context. What it means, both in terms of a concept, but also in terms of practice. Nic mentioned things like migrant resource centers. We have those sorts of initiatives as well, and all sorts of migrant-centric or migrant-facing initiatives, programs, resources, and tools that I think all of us here on the panel today would say are really, really important as we take our next steps in this, let's say, in this overall agenda, ethical recruitment agenda. I think I'll stop there. I have so much more that I can say, of course, but the 2 points of focusing on the multi-stakeholder, whole of society approach as we go forward, as well as really putting migrant workers at the center of so much of what we do, is absolutely essential. Back to you, Anbinh. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Philip. I feel like there's so much there that you started to launch into. All of those have so much depth to and add richness to the conversation, especially what you've ended with on worker voice. And it just made me think, so often we try to find solutions. All of us are here strategizing, trying to understand the problems, but so often it's the worker eventually, you know, who are in the challenging situation, but how can we give credence to the solutions that they have, to understand the issue more, or to, especially for survivors. I know that's something that the Trafficking in Persons offices really emphasize, that survivors have this lived experience that can also help provide insights and lend information to the movement. So there's so much richness in terms of what at each level, from the government to initiatives and to the evolution of how we're taking all those insights and pushing them back so that we can really find solutions that are scalable and move us forward. And with that sort of thought there about solutions and moving forward, today we talked about a lot. The audience, this is definitely a session I know that's being recorded and I plan to listen to again. But with that sort of thought, there are interventions that are need to be more funded. There are initiatives that can scale up. There are promising points that have credence and provide hope for the future. So I'd love to turn it back to the panelists for sort of a quick lightning round of where do you see that? Where do you see action that you say, yes, we need more of this, and we'll, or perhaps we should only continue this if X, it's not working as well as it should because of some bottlenecks, et cetera. So I'll turn it back to our panel of experts to share with us some of their insights on what is working and what can we do next to advance the responsible recruitment of migrant workers. Why don't we just go straight through without any confusion? We've given the first panelist, Neill, a break, but we'll just turn it right back to him and just work through to Nic, Amy, and Philip on that point.
That's great, Anbinh. Thank you. And I won't hold the time, but I'd make two quick points. Firstly, it's about including other functions within businesses, that this needs to be moved away from the CSR or sustainability department. This should become a normal operational function within businesses. Some of the greatest insights that we've learned when we've started talking to companies about responsible recruitment haven't actually come from the CSR team. It's come from the human resources team, because these are the guys who actually have to go out, engage with recruiters, are responsible for hiring and firing staff. And so getting their buy-in into many of these issues is really significant. So within companies, I think there's a really important role to play there for getting to making sure that all functions within a company are singing from the same song sheet, as it were. After you do that, of course, the first step to this, to understanding this, is mapping, as it nearly is with nearly all issues relating to workers, finding out what's going on. And in the case of migrant workers, that's finding out what your supply chain for labor looks like. So these are the places where companies should perhaps start. What is it that you don't know? And more importantly, what is it that you don't know about the way that workers are being recruited into your supply chains? So mapping is a good place to start.
Thanks, Neill. I'm always scared of what I don't know. So it's a good reminder. Turn it over to Nic.
Thanks, Anbinh. I think similar, building off of the mapping piece that Neill is talking about, one of the things that we've been hearing from migrant workers on the ground and from NGOs that are working in the ethical recruitment space is that we really just need to simplify the recruitment chain. So, companies focusing on direct hiring and using sub-agents or local recruitment agencies less. One way that I think that we can do this potentially is through investment in ethical recruitment agencies. So as I mentioned, GFEM supports a variety of different ethical recruitment agencies. One is called Terra. It's called the Ethical Recruitment Agency, which is in India. We support Pink Collar, which is in Malaysia, and we also support an ethical recruitment agency called Fair Employment Foundation. So again, I think turning to some of the trusted and true ethical recruitment agents out there would be another really important way forward.
Thanks, Nic. Yeah, there's a whole piece on the recruitment agents and what that looks like and the landscape and how, why is it's if there's too many nodes on the supply chain, too many nodes in the ethical recruitment process gets more difficult. So that's a really powerful concept. Thanks so much. I'll turn it over to Amy.
Thanks. Well, earlier you all touched on something that was near and dear to my heart, that of integrating worker voice and those with lived experiences of human trafficking. I just want to note that the theme of the 2022 TIP report this year is the importance of integrating survivor input into the development, formulation, and implementation of anti-trafficking policies and programs. Second, I would say the importance of data collection efforts, focusing on the recruitment of workers before, during, and after migration, and really focused on what is working and what measures have the greatest impact. 3, technology. I just feel like, the more we can utilize technology, whether, to look at responsible recruitment mechanisms to enhance transparency and monitoring and grievance mechanisms, that's a positive. And then I'd end with, I think it's key to use like our collective voice, the strength of our collective voice, but then also for each of us to play to our respective comparative advantage. And one little shout out, we love it when business and the private sector signals to foreign governments that they want to source in those countries where they're not forced labor concerns. Thank you, over.
Thank you, Amy. I think what you said about data collection, we need insights and analytics to make sure that what we're doing is making an impact. And it really goes to innovation. We can only innovate in areas where we have better understanding. So that's really important. And when you talk about technology too, there's so much there. And how can we harness that? How can we make that, people say tech is the solution, but how do we put our human inputs into technology to advance that? So turn it over to Philip to close us out. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anbinh. And maybe a challenge to us collectively. One of the things that we see is that so many models are built with an assumption that workers are in a regular status and going into the formal economy or into jobs in businesses that are properly licensed and regulated and overseen by government authorities. I think for us, as we try to crack this nut, we increasingly have to look at the intersection of irregular migration, the informality of the recruitment industry, which Nic very, very strongly emphasized, and also the broader informality of the economy as a whole and the informal employment that migrants are going into. It's almost a triple whammy for migrants if they're passing through informal workers going into the informal economy and they've passed over borders in an irregular situation. That I'm not sure we're there yet in terms of globally as a global agenda having the solution or the strategy to crack that nut. So if I can put that out there as one of the biggest challenges for us collectively to address in the years to come.
Thanks so much, Philip. That is just a very great point, that going from shadow to shadow to shadow, there is going to be vulnerability there. So how do we leverage groups like APEC or ASEAN or other, G7 and other groups to say, this is an issue we cannot ignore, and say, this is, a poor person issue or a marginalized person issue. This is a global issue. How are we protecting workers? How do we make more formal channels? How do we bring light into the situation? So I want to thank this excellent group of panelists today. I thought it was a very energizing session, and I'm very glad that we had this dialogue, and I'm certain that we will continue to have this dialogue moving forward. But these are really good markers and notes of points of interest. So with that, I want to thank each and every one of the panelists. I'd like to thank Chris Sullivan from the Kyle House for strategizing and working with all of us to develop this session. And I'll turn it back to Concordia, to Ashley with 1 minute to end, and thank Concordia for hosting us.
Thank you, Anbinh. On behalf of Concordia, thank you all for joining us today. A big shout out to our patron member at the Kyle House Group for hosting today's important discussion. And of course, thank you so much to today's esteemed panel. Of course, true change will stem from conversations much longer than 45 minutes, but we are thankful for the awareness you all have brought to the Concordia community, and certainly hope and trust that these conversations will not stop here. If your question was not answered today, or if you are interested in learning more about the Concordia membership community, I encourage you to reach out to membership@concordia.net. A follow-up email will be distributed next Friday with the recording from today's event and the opportunity to connect with today's panel, as well as the Kyle House group, to continue this discussion. Thank you again and have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.